There is a document that almost nobody has read. It was printed once in the year 1927 in a slim government volume called Three Last Speeches. It was never banned. It was never burned. Nobody came in the night to confiscate it from library shelves or tear it from the hands of scholars. It simply sat there, in the quiet dark of Soviet institutional archives, gathering the particular kind of dust that settles on things the system does not know how to categorize. Things too inconvenient to celebrate, too minor to suppress, too strange to explain. The document is a stenographic transcript of a speech delivered on the 20th of July, 1926, at the Central Committee plenum inside the Grand Kremlin Palace. It runs to roughly 40 pages. It is dense with numbers, production figures, overhead costs, the price of iron nails in rural gubernias, the gap between factory cost and retail markup on agricultural tools. It is, on the surface, a speech about manufacturing inefficiency, about procurement corruption, about why Soviet peasants were paying too much for basic hardware. The man who gave this speech had spent 11 years in Tsarist prisons. He had been flogged. He had escaped captivity twice. He had built from nothing the most feared internal security apparatus in Russian history. He had signed documents authorizing the detention of hundreds of thousands of people. His name was spoken in hushed tones in kitchens across the country, the way you speak the name of something you do not want to summon. Children were told to behave or he would come. Adults understood this was not entirely a metaphor. Felix Edmundovich Dzerzhinsky died on the evening of that same day, the 20th of July, 1926. Approximately 4 hours after stepping down from the podium, he was 48 years old. His last act on this earth was not an execution order. It was not a decree, a strategic directive, or an act of revolutionary will. His last act was arguing for 2 hours straight in July heat without water about the price of nails. This is not a joke. This is the stenogram. And this is where the story gets interesting, and because that document, that dusty, unread, uncelebrated 40-page transcript, is not just a record of a speech, it is a key. It unlocks something about the man that no biography has ever quite managed to explain, something that no monument has ever captured, and something that the Soviet state, and every state that came after it, had very strong reasons to leave locked. We are trained culturally to hold certain figures in fixed positions. The executioner does not become the reformer. The secret policeman does not become the advocate for rural consumers. The architect of a terror apparatus does not spend his final breath demanding that peasants have access to affordable iron goods. These narratives do not fit together. The human mind resists them. We want our historical villains to die as they lived, in darkness, in violence, in some operatic confirmation of their nature. Dzerzhinsky refuses to cooperate with this expectation. He is depending on which decade you consult and which archive you trust. At least 3 entirely different people simultaneously. The revolutionary martyr, imprisoned and exiled by the Tsar for his beliefs. The cold-eyed head of the Cheka, signing his name to policies that tore families apart. And the exhausted industrial administrator, riding overnight trains to factory floors in the Urals, to personally inspect production records at 4 in the morning. History textbooks, when they mention him at all, pick one of these versions and stick with it. The Soviet textbooks pick the first and, carefully, the second. The loyal servant of the revolution, the incorruptible sword. The post-Soviet textbooks pick the second and nothing else. The instrument of repression, the face of state violence, end of discussion. Nobody picked the third. Nobody wanted to deal with the man who spent his last 4 years obsessively studying the economics of Soviet manufacturing, who knew the overhead cost structure of the Urals metallurgical combine better than anyone in the Politburo, who died worrying about nails. The third version does not simplify, it complicates, and complication is uncomfortable, particularly when the person being complicated is supposed to serve as a clean symbol, either of revolutionary heroism or of historical evil. But complication is also where truth lives. and the truth about Felix Dzerzhinsky, visible only when you read that speech in full, when you follow the stenographer's pen across those 40 pages, watching the sentences get shorter and angrier as the afternoon light moved across the Kremlin's windows, is stranger and more tragic than any of the simplified versions. Here's the central paradox this story is built around, and it is worth stating plainly before we go any further. The man who built the Soviet security state, who created the institutional machinery that would eventually be used to destroy nearly everyone in that room with him on the day he died, spent his final years fighting loudly and at personal cost to his health against exactly the kind of systemic rot that makes security states monstrous. He fought against bureaucratic paralysis, against officials who produced false statistics to protect their positions, against the gap between what the party said it was doing for ordinary working people and what was actually happening to ordinary working people. He fought against a specific concrete injustice that the Soviet peasant, having survived revolution and civil war and famine, was now being quietly robbed through pricing policy, paying inflated prices for manufactured goods while selling agricultural products at artificially depressed rates. He was right about all of it. The records confirm this. The economists who came after him confirm this. The events of the 1930s confirm this in the most catastrophic possible way. He was also dead before any of it mattered, and the machine he had built, the one that answered to no economic logic, only to political will, rolled forward without him in the exact direction he had warned against and produced consequences that he had in that 40-page document essentially predicted. The book that contains the transcript, Three Last Speeches, 1927, was printed in a small edition and distributed within party circles. It did not circulate widely. It was not suppressed. Suppression would have required someone to recognize it as dangerous. And the bureaucratic instinct then, as now, was to ignore what could not be easily categorized rather than to confront it. In the 1960s, a few historians cited it in footnotes. In the 1990s, it was digitized as part of a broader archival project. Today, it exists in open access, readable by anyone with an internet connection and the patience to navigate Soviet-era typography. Almost no one has read it, not because it is hidden, because it is boring, because it is about overhead costs and procurement irregularities and interdepartmental coordination failures. Because the title Three Last Speeches does not suggest that anything important is inside, because we look at the name Dzerzhinsky on the cover and think, we already know what kind of document this is and we move on. This investigation is about what happens when you do not move on. When you sit with those 40 pages and follow the voice inside them, a voice that gets louder and faster and more desperate as the afternoon wears on. A voice that is trying to say something important to a room full of people who are mostly thinking about something else entirely. What that voice is saying, it turns out, is not just about nails. It is about what happens to a system when the people inside it stop being honest about what is actually happening. It is about the cost of performing certainty when reality is something different. It is about the particular loneliness of being the person in the room who knows the numbers, really knows them, and can see exactly where the numbers lead. It is, in other words, about something that did not stay in 1926. Something that has a very long, very continuous afterlife. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, the room, the people in it, the summer heat and the closed windows, and the man standing at the podium with a stack of papers and a hand pressed to his chest. The story begins there. The Grand Kremlin Palace in July is not a comfortable place to spend 6 consecutive days. The building was designed for ceremony, not for the kind of work that actually runs a country. Its halls are vast and ornate in the way that imperial architecture is always ornate, built to communicate power rather than to facilitate it. By the 6th day of the plenum, the 20th of July, 1926, the ceremonial grandeur had long since been overwhelmed by the particular atmosphere that forms when more than 100 people have been sitting in the same closed rooms for nearly a week in summer heat. arguing about things they cannot agree on, with no resolution in sight. The windows were kept shut. This was not a matter of comfort. This was procedure. Plenums of the Central Committee were classified gatherings, and the habit of secrecy that had been built into Bolshevik organizational culture over decades of underground work did not evaporate simply because the party was now in power, and there was nobody outside the windows worth worrying about. The windows stayed closed. The air stayed still. The temperature by midday had settled somewhere that made concentration difficult and tempers shorter than they would otherwise have been. 117 people, by the stenographer's count, were present in the hall that morning. They were not ordinary people in any sense that the word ordinary usually applies. They were the surviving leadership of a revolutionary movement that had, against most reasonable predictions, seized and held control of the largest country on earth. They had outlasted the Tsar, the whites, the foreign interventionists, the famine, the Civil War, and each other, at least so far. They were collectively some of the most politically sophisticated human beings alive in that moment, which is to say they were people who had learned to read rooms, read faces, read the silences between words with the precision that only comes from years of operating in environments where a misread could cost you everything. They were also on that particular Tuesday watching each other with the specific wariness of people who know that the room has shifted, that the ground under the old arrangements has become unreliable, and that what happens in the next several days will determine a great deal about who survives the decade in any position worth holding. To understand what was actually happening in that room, beneath the official agenda, beneath the economic reports and the procedural motions, you have to understand what 1926 meant inside the Soviet political structure. Lenin had been dead for 2 years. The succession question, which everyone had known was coming and nobody had been willing to fully address while Lenin was still alive, had now fully arrived. The party that had operated for most of its existence as a disciplined revolutionary organization with a clear hierarchy and a shared sense of purpose, had fractured along lines that were partly personal, partly ideological, and partly the straightforward result of human beings competing for a position of enormous power with very limited rules about how that competition was supposed to be conducted. On one side of that fractured room sat the apparatus, the General Secretariat, the provincial party committees. The organizational infrastructure that had been painstakingly built over the previous 4 years by a man who understood with extraordinary clarity that control of appointments and records and procedural processes was control of everything else. Joseph Stalin had spent those 4 years building a majority inside the Central Committee the way an engineer builds a load-bearing structure, quietly, methodically, piece by piece, making sure each element was in place before adding the next. By July of 1926, the structure was essentially complete. He did not need to raise his voice. He did not need to argue. He needed only to sit in the presidium and wait, because the votes were already his. This is a crucial thing to understand about that room, and about the particular tableau that would unfold over the course of that afternoon. Stalin's power in that moment was not the power of the loudest voice or the most compelling argument. It was the power of someone who has already won the game and is now simply watching the other players finish their moves. He spoke rarely during those 6 days. He let others carry the debate. He made small procedural suggestions in a quiet voice. He smiled sometimes at remarks that did not seem to call for smiling. His silence was more eloquent than most people's speeches. On the other side of the room sat what history would call the United Opposition, which is one of those political labels that is technically accurate and almost entirely misleading because it suggests a coherence and unity that the reality did not support. 11 people formed the visible core of this opposition, and they had arrived at their alliance through a process that resembled, more than anything else, the logic of a sinking ship. Leon Trotsky and Grigory Zinoviev had spent the previous 2 years as bitter enemies. Not in the ordinary political sense of people who disagree on policy, but in the visceral, personal sense of people who had said things about each other in public that cannot easily be forgiven. Zinoviev had been one of the primary architects of the campaign to isolate and discredit Trotsky after Lenin's death. Trotsky had returned the favor in characteristically sharp prose, and yet here they were, sitting on the same side of the room, having concluded, separately and then together, that the alternative to alliance was individual defeat. They had brought with them Lev Kamenev, who had been Lenin's deputy in Moscow and was now watching his political base erode in real time. They had brought Nadezhda Krupskaya, Lenin's widow, whose presence in the opposition was symbolically significant enough that everyone in the room noticed it and few were willing to comment on it directly. They had brought Yuri Pyatakov, an economist and industrial administrator of genuine ability, who was serving as deputy chairman of the Supreme Council of the National Economy, and who had that same morning delivered a report containing statistics that at least one person in the room considered deeply personally wrong. The united opposition had come to the plenum with the intention of forcing a debate. They knew they did not have the votes to change outcomes through formal procedure. What they had was the right to speak, the ability to argue, and the hope, increasingly thin as the week had worn on, that the force of their arguments might shift something in the public record, might create a document of dissent that would matter later, might at minimum establish that someone had said clearly and on the record that the direction being taken was the wrong one. They were, in the political language of their own tradition, fighting a rearguard action. Everyone in the room understood this, including them. Between these two formations, the settled majority and the embattled opposition, stood a third figure who did not fit cleanly into either camp, and whose position in the room that day was more complicated than the simple geometry of left and right suggests. Felix Dzerzhinsky had arrived that morning carrying a leather satchel filled with papers. This was not unusual. He always carried papers. What was unusual, or at least what those who knew him well noted later, was the particular quality of his focus. He had been in the hall since early morning, working through columns of figures, making notations in the margins of documents, occasionally pulling new sheets from the satchel and cross-referencing them against what he had written the night before. Anastas Mikoyan, who would later write about that day in his memoirs with the careful retrospective clarity of a man who had survived everything, recalled noticing Dzerzhinsky's right hand, not because of what it was doing. It was simply resting against his chest, pressed there in a gesture that looked from a distance like a man thinking. But Mikoyan had known Dzerzhinsky for years, and he had seen that gesture before, and he understood what it usually meant. He said nothing. This, too, is important. In that room on that day, there were things that people knew and did not say, and that particular silence, the silence of people who see something and choose not to name it, runs through the entire history of what happened, like a thread pulled too tight. Dzerzhinsky was 48 years old. He was not a young 48. 11 years of czarist imprisonment had done the kind of physical damage that does not repair itself regardless of subsequent circumstance. His heart had been a source of medical concern for at least 4 years. The doctors who treated him, and there were several because men in his position had access to the best available care, had been asking him in language that grew progressively less polite as the years passed to reduce his workload. He worked 14 to 16 hours a day. He had not taken a proper rest since the early 1920s. He drove himself with the kind of systematic disregard for physical limitation that in another context might be called courage, and in the medical context was called something considerably less flattering. He was not at the plenum that day as a neutral observer. He had come with a specific and personal reason for being there, a reason rooted in 4 years of work that had changed him in ways that even his closest colleagues had not fully registered. The official agenda for the 6th day of the plenum listed as its primary topic the economic condition of the USSR, with particular reference to pricing disparities, between industrial and agricultural goods and the performance of the Supreme Council of the national economy over the preceding period. This was, in the language of internal Soviet documents, a description of a battlefield, the so-called scissors crisis, the widening gap between the prices peasants paid for manufactured goods and the prices they received for agricultural products, had been a central source of economic and political tension for years. It was not a new problem. It had been identified, named, debated, and subjected to policy intervention repeatedly. It persisted anyway in the way that problems persist when the institutional incentives of the system that is supposed to solve them are not aligned with actually solving them. Kamenev, in his capacity as a deputy chairman of the Council of People's Commissars, had delivered a report earlier in the week that addressed this problem. The report contained numbers. Some of those numbers were, depending on how you read them and which underlying data you trusted, either accurate or significantly misleading. Pyatakov had delivered his own report that morning as head of the industrial side of the economy, with figures that told a particular story about manufacturing costs and pricing structures. Dzerzhinsky had been listening to these reports with the attention of a man who knows the underlying data better than the people presenting it. He had spent 4 years inside the industrial machinery of the Soviet economy in a way that almost no other senior political figure had. He had visited factories, he had read production logs, he had sat with engineers and accountants and argued over line items. He knew, in the specific and unglamorous way that only comes from that kind of sustained attention, what the numbers actually meant and, more importantly, what the numbers were being made to mean in service of arguments that had less to do with economics than with the positioning of factions inside a political war. By the time the morning session broke and reassembled and the afternoon agenda opened, he had made a decision. He gathered his papers. He pressed his right hand, briefly and unconsciously, against his chest. He stood. And at 1:30 in the afternoon, on the 20th of July, 1926, Felix Dzerzhinsky walked to the podium of the Central Committee plenum and began to speak. To understand why a man who ran the Soviet secret police spent the last 4 years of his life arguing about manufacturing costs, you have to go back to the spring of 1922 and to a decision that nobody at the time thought was particularly significant. Lenin was already ill. The strokes that would eventually kill him were not yet public knowledge, but inside the upper levels of the party, the people who had access to the medical reports and could read what was happening in the gaps between his public appearances knew that something was wrong and that it was not going to get better. The Bolshevik leadership was, in the quiet and unacknowledged way of institutions that cannot afford to admit their own vulnerability, beginning the long process of preparing for a future without the person around whom everything had been organized. In this context, a series of personnel decisions were being made. Decisions about who would go where, who would take over which portfolio, how the administrative machinery of the new Soviet state would be staffed at its senior levels. Many of these decisions had the quality of improvisation. The Bolsheviks had spent years planning a revolution and almost no time planning what came after. The apparatus of governance they were building was being assembled in real time with the materials available by people who were learning on the job in ways that the job's consequences made extremely unforgiving. It was in this context that Felix Dzerzhinsky, in February of 1922, was appointed chairman of the Supreme Council of the National Economy, the VSNKH, which was the institution responsible for managing the entire industrial output of Soviet Russia. He retained his position at the head of the Cheka simultaneously. Nobody appears to have considered this combination strange, or if they did not say so in any document that has survived. The appointment was, on its face, absurd. Dzerzhinsky had no formal training in economics. He had no background in industrial management. He was a professional revolutionary who had spent the most formative decades of his adult life in various forms of captivity or underground organizational work, neither of which provided much preparation for managing the procurement schedules of metallurgical combines. The logic of the appointment, to the extent that there was logic, seems to have been the logic that was applied to many such decisions in that period. The man is capable, he's loyal, he's ruthless when ruthlessness is required, and the institution needs someone who can impose order. Put him there and see what happens. What happened was not what anyone predicted. Dzerzhinsky took the appointment seriously in a way that, looking back at the documentary record, seems almost compulsive. He did not treat the chairmanship of VSNKH as an administrative title to be held alongside his security portfolio, while the real work was delegated downward. He treated it as a problem to be solved personally through direct engagement with the actual conditions of Soviet industry. Within the first months of his appointment, he had begun traveling, not the kind of travel that senior officials typically undertook. Inspections carefully arranged in advance, facilities cleaned and organized for the visit, managers briefed on what to say and what to leave out. He went unannounced. He arrived at factories in the early morning hours before the management had time to prepare. He walked production floors. He talked to workers and foremen and engineers, not in the formal context of a meeting, but in the informal context of someone who wanted to understand what was actually happening. He kept notes. Detailed, obsessive notes in the small handwriting that appears throughout the archival documents from this period. Columns of figures, questions that had been answered and questions that had not, names of individuals who had told him things he wanted to follow up on, discrepancies between what the official report said and what he had observed with his own eyes. The notebooks from these years are, in their own way, a remarkable document. They are the record of a man teaching himself an entire field of knowledge from first principles, using direct observation as his primary methodology. By the end of 1922, he had identified the central problem, or at least the central problem as he understood it. Soviet industry was not failing primarily because of resource shortages or technological backwardness, though both of these were real. It was failing because of the relationship between what things actually cost to produce and what the official accounts said they cost. The gap between real cost and reported cost was not a minor accounting discrepancy. It was, in many facilities, enormous, and it was not accidental. It was the result of a system in which managers had strong incentives to misrepresent their cost structures and almost no incentive to be accurate. This problem had a name in the economic literature, though Dzerzhinsky approached it from a direction that had little to do with economic theory. He approached it the way a detective approaches a case. Something is wrong. The evidence of wrongness is visible if you know where to look, and the question is who is doing what and why. In 1923, he created what he called, with characteristic bluntness, the Metal Commission, a body tasked with investigating the cost structures of the Soviet metallurgical industry. He staffed it partly with engineers and accountants, and partly, according to accounts from the period, with people who had backgrounds in investigative work. The combination was deliberate. He wanted people who understood both the technical substance and the methodology of finding things that other people were trying not to show. The commission produced reports. The reports contained findings. The findings were, by the standards of what had been officially acknowledged about Soviet industrial performance up to that point, startling. The cost of producing a ton of metal at several major facilities was substantially higher than the official figures suggested. In some cases, the discrepancy was a matter of legitimate accounting differences. Questions about how overhead should be allocated, how depreciation should be calculated, technical disputes with multiple defensible answers. But in other cases, the discrepancy was not defensible on any technical basis. Numbers had been arranged to tell a story that the underlying reality did not support. Dzerzhinsky brought these findings to the attention of the relevant party bodies. The response was, broadly speaking, the kind of response that institutional systems typically produce when presented with findings that are inconvenient. Acknowledgement, expressions of concern, promises of corrective action, and then a return to the previous state of affairs with minor cosmetic adjustments. The incentive structures that had produced the misrepresentation were not addressed because addressing them would have required changing things that people in positions of power had reasons to prefer unchanged. He went back. He ran the commission again. He found the same problems, in some cases worse. He reported again. He received the same response. This cycle repeated with variations over the course of 4 years. And something happened to Dzerzhinsky in the course of those repetitions that is visible in the documentary record if you trace it carefully. He became progressively more frustrated, not in the ordinary sense of a bureaucrat who is annoyed that his recommendations are not being followed. Something deeper and more personal than that. He had come to understand, had built the understanding piece by piece through years of direct observation, exactly what was wrong and exactly what needed to change. He could see it with a clarity that came from having looked at the actual evidence rather than the curated presentations of the evidence, and the system around him could not or would not see it. There is a particular kind of loneliness in being the person who knows. Not believes, knows, in the specific sense of having done the work, checked the figures, walked the floors, sat with the engineers at 4 in the morning, and watched them struggle with problems that the official accounts pretended did not exist. Dzerzhinsky had that loneliness by 1925, and it is present in his correspondence from that period in a way that his earlier letters do not show. He wrote to his wife Sophia in the summer of 1925, "The work is endless, and I'm not sure the work is reaching anywhere." He did not elaborate. He rarely did, in personal correspondence. But the sentence sits in the archive like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples from it reach forward to the afternoon of July 20th, 1926, and the podium, and the papers, and the hand pressed to the chest. By the time the plenum of July 1926 arrived, Dzerzhinsky had been living inside the Soviet industrial economy for 4 years, with an intensity that no other senior political figure had matched. He knew things that Kamenev did not know when Kamenev delivered his report. He knew things that Pyatakov did not know, or had chosen not to say, when Pyatakov presented his figures that morning. This is not a small claim, and it deserves to be treated carefully. Pyatakov was not an unintelligent man. He was, by the assessment of most who worked with him, one of the genuinely capable economic administrators of his generation. He understood the Soviet industrial system in ways that most of his contemporaries did not. But he was also, by July of 1926, a committed member of the United Opposition, which meant that his understanding of the industrial situation was being filtered through the requirements of a political argument. The figures in his report were not invented, but they were selected, they were arranged, they were presented in a context designed to support conclusions that the underlying data taken whole did not cleanly support. Dzerzhinsky knew this because he had the underlying data. He had been building it figure by figure for 4 years. He had the cost structures of the major metallurgical facilities. He had the procurement records. He had the overhead analyses. He had, sitting in that leather satchel on the desk in front of him, a set of numbers that told a substantially different story from the one that had been presented to the plenum that morning. He had something else, too. He had the specific, visceral knowledge of what those numbers meant for the people they described. The pricing gap that he had been fighting, the excess cost of manufactured goods that fell ultimately on the rural consumer, was not for Dzerzhinsky an abstract economic variable. He had been to the villages. He had talked to the people. He had heard in the specific and unglamorous language of people who were being squeezed what it meant in practical terms when the price of a kilogram of nails was set at a level that represented several days of agricultural labor. He carried that knowledge with him to the podium in a way that made what might otherwise have been a technical presentation into something considerably more charged. His health, by the summer of 1926, was not compatible with what he was asking of himself. The doctors had been clear about this for years. The cardiac symptoms that had first appeared in the early 1920s had not improved. They had, under the sustained pressure of the workload he refused to reduce, become worse. He had been asked in terms that his physicians presumably thought were unambiguous to slow down, to take rest, to accept that the body he inhabited had accumulated a kind of damage that could not be undone and could only be managed, and that managing it required constraints on his activity that he found apparently impossible to accept. He did not rest. He continued working the 14 to 16-hour days that he had maintained throughout his tenure at VSNKH. He continued traveling to factories. He continued sitting with his notebooks in the early morning hours, working through figures. He continued showing up to meetings that his doctors had told him to skip, delivering reports that his doctors had told him to delegate, engaging in arguments that his doctors had told him to avoid. Why? This is a question that the documents do not answer directly, and any answer must be understood as inference rather than fact. But the inference that the record supports is this: he believed the work was urgent in a way that made the physical cost irrelevant, or at least secondary. He believed, and the subsequent history suggests he was not wrong, that what was happening in the Soviet economy in those years was not a set of correctable technical problems, but a set of structural choices that were leading toward a specific and foreseeable catastrophe. He believed that someone needed to say this clearly, loudly, and on the record, because the alternative was that nobody would. He had been saying it for 4 years in reports and commissions and internal memos. The reports had been received, the commissions had been acknowledged, the memos had been read, or at least opened and set aside, and the structural choices had continued largely unchanged because the people making them had reasons that had nothing to do with the technical merits of the economic argument. On the 20th of July, 1926, he decided to say it one more time. In the largest possible forum to the largest possible audience of people who had the power to change things, in the most direct possible language he could find, he gathered his papers. He stood. He walked to the podium. He had, at that point, approximately 2 hours left to say everything he needed to say. He did not waste a single one of them. He did not begin with pleasantries. This was noted by several people in the room, and noted in a way that suggests it was remarkable even by the standards of a political culture that had largely dispensed with the polite fictions of parliamentary procedure. Plenums of the Central Committee in this period were not gentle gatherings. People interrupted each other. People said things that, in other institutional contexts, would have ended careers on the spot. The stenographic record of any given session from these years reads like a transcript of a very high-stakes argument conducted by people who had stopped pretending that argument was anything other than what it was. Even so, there was usually a formal opening, an acknowledgement of the chair, a statement of the speaker's position relative to the questions on the agenda, a brief ritual gesture toward the procedural framework within which the speech was nominally occurring. Dzerzhinsky skipped all of it. He put his papers on the podium, looked out at the room, and began with numbers. Specific numbers, not rounded figures, not approximations, not the kind of carefully managed statistics that had characterized the reports delivered earlier in the week. He cited production figures for particular facilities, in particular quarters, overhead cost allocations broken down by category, the specific price differential on specific categories of manufactured goods in specific rural markets. He cited them from memory and from his notes, alternating between the two with the fluency of someone who had been living inside this material for years, and for whom it had long since ceased to be data, and had become something more like landscape, familiar terrain that he could navigate without looking at a map. The room, which had been in the particular state of restless inattention that characterizes the 6th day of any long meeting, became quiet. Not the silence of people who have been commanded to be silent, but the different silence of people who have registered, almost involuntarily, that something is happening that is worth listening to. He was attacking Kamenev first. This was immediately clear, though the attack was conducted in its opening stages through the medium of the numbers themselves rather than through direct accusation. The report that Kamenev had delivered earlier in the week had cited a set of figures about pricing trends in the industrial sector. Dzerzhinsky was now placing, alongside those figures, a different set of figures, figures from the same period covering the same categories, drawn from sources that he named explicitly and that several people in the room would have been able to verify or dispute. The gap between Kamenev's figures and Dzerzhinsky's figures was not small. It was not the kind of gap that could be attributed to legitimate methodological differences. It was the kind of gap that meant one of the two sets of figures was not describing reality. He did not say this yet. He let the gap sit in the room and speak for itself while he moved on to the next category of figures, and the next. 20 minutes into the speech, the stenographic record begins to show something that is not visible in a casual reading, but becomes unmistakable when you study the document closely. The interruptions start. In Soviet stenographic convention, audience responses were recorded in parenthetical notations within the transcript. These notations, laughter, applause, noise in the hall, voices, a remark from the floor, are not decorative. They are evidence, they tell you, with the precision that only real-time documentation can provide, exactly how a room was responding to what was being said and when. In the first 20 minutes of the speech, the parenthetical notations are sparse. The room is listening. There are occasional notations of voices, the kind of low-level murmuring that indicates engagement rather than disruption, but no significant interruptions. People are hearing something unexpected and are, collectively, deciding what to do with it. At approximately the 20-minute mark, Dzerzhinsky shifts from the numbers to their implications. He begins to describe, in terms that move from the technical to the political, with a speed that the room had not anticipated, what the figures he has presented mean for the actual condition of the Soviet industrial economy and for the people who depend on that economy, the rural consumer, the peasant household trying to maintain agricultural equipment on an income that the pricing structure had made inadequate for the purpose. The gap between what the party said it was doing for working people and what was actually being done. The notations change. Noise in the hall. A remark. Voices. Noise in the hall. He keeps going. The turn toward Pyatakov came at approximately the 40-minute mark, and it is the moment in the speech that, once you have read it, you cannot unread. Pyatakov had delivered his report that morning in his capacity as deputy chairman of VSNKH, Dzerzhinsky's own institution where Pyatakov had been serving under him. The report had contained figures about industrial production costs and pricing structures. The figures had been cited in support of arguments that the opposition was making about economic policy. They were, from Dzerzhinsky's perspective, wrong. Not approximately wrong, not defensively wrong in the way that complex economic data can be arranged to support multiple interpretations. Specifically, deliberately, consequentially wrong in ways that Dzerzhinsky could demonstrate with the data he was holding. He turned to face Pyatakov directly, in a gesture that the stenographic record does not capture, but that Mikoyan later described as having a quality that silenced the room before the words came. He said, and the stenogram records this verbatim, that Pyatakov was the largest disorganizer of Soviet industry that he had encountered in 4 years of working in that industry. He said this in front of 117 people, many of whom had worked with Pyatakov for years, and regarded him as one of the more capable economic administrators in the Soviet apparatus. He said it without qualification, without the hedging language that Soviet political discourse had developed as a way of making serious accusations appear to be technical observations. He said it as a fact, supported by evidence he was prepared to present. Noise in the hall. The stenographer wrote it 3 times in succession, which, in the conventions of Soviet stenographic practice, indicated something close to uproar. Pyatakov attempted to respond from his seat. The exchange that followed lasted several minutes and was recorded in fragmented form. Shouts, counter-shouts, the chair attempting to restore order, Dzerzhinsky refusing to yield the floor. What is clear from the transcript is that Dzerzhinsky did not retreat from the accusation. He elaborated it. He provided specifics. He named figures, named discrepancies, named the moments in the record where the data that Pyatakov had presented to the plenum diverged from the data that Dzerzhinsky's commission had accumulated over 4 years of direct investigation. The word he used for Pyatakov's statistics, in Russian, lukavyi, was not a technical term. It was a moral one. Its most direct translation is cunning or sly, but in the political language of that moment and that culture, applied to a colleague's official report in front of the full Central Committee, it meant something considerably more specific. It meant, you are lying, and you know you are lying, and I know you know, and I am saying it in front of everyone. The room understood this. The noise in the hall did not subside for several minutes. The turn toward Kamenev, when it came, produced the sentence that has outlasted everything else in the speech. Outlasted the specific arguments, the specific figures, the specific political context that made those figures matter. It has survived because it is the kind of sentence that is true in ways that extend far beyond the occasion that produced it. Kamenev had said something from his seat. The stenogram records a remark from Kamenev, but does not transcribe the remark itself, which suggests it was delivered quietly enough that the stenographer did not catch it. What it was, based on the response it produced, was apparently a suggestion that Dzerzhinsky, at 48, did not have the perspective or experience to judge the economic questions he was addressing. Dzerzhinsky stopped. There is a pause visible in the transcript, not noted explicitly but inferable from the way the text moves. And then he said, "You will be good for nothing at 44 because you occupy yourself with political maneuvering instead of work." Kamenev was 43 years old at the time. The remark landed with the precision of something that had been waiting a long time to be said. Noise in the hall. Several voices at once, the chair calling for order. Dzerzhinsky, according to Mikoyan's later account, standing completely still at the podium while the room reacted around him as though the noise were something happening at a distance. What made the sentence remarkable was not its sharpness, though it was sharp. It was its specificity. Dzerzhinsky was not insulting Kamenev in the general way of political combat, not calling his intelligence into question, or his loyalty, or his revolutionary credentials. He was making a precise diagnosis of a precise failure, the substitution of political positioning for actual engagement with actual problems. The disease he was naming, performing the appearance of work rather than doing the work, managing impressions rather than managing reality, was not a personal failing in his analysis. It was systemic. It was what happened when the incentive structure rewarded the performance over the substance. He had been watching it for 4 years. He had been fighting it for 4 years. He had the evidence of it sitting in the leather satchel on the podium in front of him. He was not done. Speech continued for another hour and 20 minutes after the exchange with Kamenev. What happened to the room during that time is visible if you know how to read the transcript. The parenthetical notations shift in character. The noise in the hall becomes less frequent, not because the room is relaxed, but because something else is happening. The particular quality of attention that comes over a group of people when they have registered collectively that they are watching something they have not seen before and may not see again. Dzerzhinsky moved through the economic arguments with a systematic thoroughness that would have been remarkable in any speaker and was extraordinary given the conditions. The room was hot. He had no water. He had been speaking for over an hour. The afternoon light was moving across the high windows of the palace in the slow way of summer afternoons, marking time in a way that the proceedings themselves could not. His sentences in the early part of the speech had been long and elaborately structured. The sentences of someone laying out a complex argument that requires each element to be in place before the next can be properly understood. As the speech continued, they became shorter. The stenographic record shows this clearly, and it shows something else as well. The pace was accelerating. He was moving faster. The pauses between major points, which in the first 30 minutes had been sufficient for the room to register what had just been said, were compressing. He was trying to get through more material in less time. Whether he was aware of this, whether he understood on some level what it meant that he was accelerating rather than slowing, the document cannot tell us. What it can tell us is that the material he was accelerating through was not padding. Every section of the speech that has been checked against available economic records from the period is proven accurate. The figures he cited were the right figures. The discrepancies he identified were real discrepancies. The structural problems he described, the pricing mechanisms that were hurting rural consumers, the cost accounting failures that were masking real inefficiencies, the gap between what the party apparatus was reporting and what was actually happening in the Soviet industrial economy, were real problems, and they remained real problems long after he was gone. He was right. This is the thing that is hardest to hold alongside everything else about him, and the most important thing to hold. The man was right. The last section of the speech turned unexpectedly personal. He had been speaking for almost 2 hours. The argument had been made. The figures had been presented. The accusations had been delivered and survived the noise they produced. What remained was something that the transcript records with a plainness that is almost startling, a plainness that suggests either that Dzerzhinsky had abandoned rhetorical calculation by this point, or that what he said in those final minutes was simply true, and he had decided that truth, stated plainly, was the only instrument he had left. He said the problems he had described were not new. He had been describing them for 4 years. He had submitted reports. He had formed commissions. He had presented findings. He had been heard, acknowledged, and then watched the same problems continue. He was not asking for his analysis to be accepted on faith. He was asking for it to be checked against the evidence he had provided, and if the evidence supported the analysis, for something to be done. And then the final sentence, recorded verbatim in the stenogram in the shorthand notation that the stenographer would later transcribe into type, preserving it in the slim 1927 volume that would sit untouched in library archives for decades. My strength lies in the fact that I never spare myself, but it is difficult for me to manage alone, and so I ask for your help. The hall, according to the stenographic record, did not respond. There's no notation of applause, no notation of voices or noise. The transcript moves directly from the final sentence of the speech to the notation that Dzerzhinsky has left the podium, and then to the procedural notation indicating that the session will continue. 117 people heard that sentence. Not one of them in any document that has survived recorded what they thought when they heard it. What happened after he stepped down from the podium was described later by several witnesses in memoirs and testimonies that vary in detail but agree on the essential sequence. His face when he turned from the podium was the color of ash. The hand that had been pressed intermittently to his chest throughout the speech was pressed there continuously now. Several people moved toward him. He waved them off, not rudely, but with the decisive gesture of someone who has not finished what they are doing and does not want to be interrupted. He was taken to an anteroom adjacent to the main hall. A doctor was called. Dzerzhinsky refused to be examined. He wanted to hear the response from Kamenev, which was being delivered in the hall through the wall. He lay on a couch in the anteroom, with his papers still in his hands, listening to the sound of Kamenev's voice carrying through the partition, making notes. He was preparing his rebuttal. He lay there for 2 hours. The speech in the hall continued. His notes accumulated. He was, by every account, entirely focused on the argument that was still ongoing in the room he had left, tracking it, responding to it in the margins of his documents, waiting for the moment when he could go back and address whatever had been said in his absence, At some point in that 2 hours he stood, he told the people with him that he was going home. He gathered his papers. He left. At 16 minutes past 4 in the afternoon, in his apartment on Bolshaya Lubyanka Street, Felix Dzerzhinsky died. The cause was recorded as heart failure. He was 48 years old. The session of the Central Committee plenum continued until evening. Business proceeded in the ordinary way. The stenographers kept their notebooks. The votes were counted. The agenda moved forward. Nobody went back to address what he had asked for help with. Here's what happened to the people in that room. Not in the long arc of history, not in the abstracted language of political consequence, but specifically, personally, in the years that followed the afternoon of July 20th, 1926, when 117 people heard a man ask for help and said nothing. Yuri Pyatakov, the man Dzerzhinsky had called the largest disorganizer of Soviet industry in front of the full Central Committee, the man whose figures he had taken apart number by number in the July heat, was arrested in 1936. He confessed in the manner of that period to crimes that the evidence suggests he did not commit. He was shot in January of 1937. He was 50 years old. The industry he had helped administer was, by the time of his death, operating under the exact conditions that Dzerzhinsky had warned would produce catastrophe. Lev Kamenev, the man who would be good for nothing at 44, did not reach 44 in any position worth holding. He was expelled from the party, readmitted, expelled again. He was arrested, tried, and shot in August of 1936. He was 52 years old. The sentence that Dzerzhinsky had thrown at him across the hall of the Kremlin Palace about political maneuvering substituted for work was, in the end, a description of the only tool available to someone who had already lost the game. Grigory Zinoviev was shot the same month as Kamenev, the same week, the same process. He had been Lenin's closest associate for years. He died in a basement in Moscow, having spent his final public appearances agreeing in writing and in court with accusations he knew to be false. He was 52 years old. Nikolai Moralov, who had spoken from the floor during the plenum in support of the opposition, was shot in February of 1937. He was 55. Leon Trotsky, who had sat across the room from Dzerzhinsky that afternoon, who had led the opposition with a brilliance that the political situation had already made irrelevant, who had called Dzerzhinsky's economic statistics inadequate in a remark that the stenographer dutifully recorded, was expelled from the Soviet Union in 1929. He lived in exile for 11 years, moving from country to country, writing, arguing, watching from a distance as everything he had predicted came true in ways worse than he had predicted. In August of 1940, he was killed in Mexico City. He was 60 years old. The instrument of his death was an ice axe carried by a man who had been sent from Moscow. Nadezhda Krupskaya, Lenin's widow, whose presence in the opposition had been the most symbolically weighted fact of the entire plenum, survived. She made her accommodations with the new reality, as people who wish to survive must do. She died in 1939 in her bed at 70 years old. Whether she considered this a form of luck or something else, no document records. Anastas Mikoyan, the man who had noticed Dzerzhinsky's hand pressed to his chest all morning, who had said nothing, who had understood what the gesture meant and had chosen not to name it, survived everything. He survived Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, and Brezhnev. He served in senior positions under all of them. He died in October of 1978 in his own bed at 82 years old. He was the last man standing from that room, from that afternoon, from that entire world. He had written about the 20th of July in his memoirs. He described Dzerzhinsky's speech with respect and evident sorrow. He described the hand pressed to the chest. He described the gray face after the podium. He did not describe what he had been thinking when he watched all of it happen and said nothing. Perhaps there was nothing to say. Perhaps the calculation was the kind that people in that room made constantly, the calculation of what could be changed and what could not. and what the cost of attempting to change it would be. Perhaps McCoyan had simply learned earlier and more thoroughly than most the lesson that the 20th century was in the business of teaching, that survival is its own form of work, and it demands a discipline as complete and as costly as any other. Now for the paradox that history, if it has any sense of structure, should have found too neat to be true. In 1937, 11 years after the July afternoon when Dzerzhinsky died arguing about the cost of manufactured goods, Stalin referred to him in internal party documents as a highly active Trotskyist, not a former ally, not a complicated figure whose legacy required careful handling, a Trotskyist, an enemy, a man who had apparently been working against the revolution the entire time. The man who had built the security apparatus that was now being used to destroy everyone in that room was classified by the apparatus he had built as an enemy of the state. He was dead, so it cost him nothing. But the classification tells you something important about the system he had created, something that he had perhaps understood in those 4 years of fighting bureaucratic misrepresentation without being able to fully articulate what it meant for his own creation. The system he had built did not distinguish between categories of people. It distinguished between useful and not useful, between the moment's requirements and everything else. A man who had devoted his life to the revolution could become retroactively an enemy of it. The logic was not personal, it was institutional. The machine did not remember who had built it. What Dzerzhinsky had been fighting for in that speech and in the 4 years of work that preceded it was a version of Soviet economic policy that protected the rural consumer, preserved the elements of market flexibility that NEP had introduced, and prevented the systematic extraction from the peasantry that the emerging political consensus was beginning to contemplate. He lost that fight. He lost it partly because he died before it was fully decided, and partly because the people who might have continued it were, within the decade, dead or silenced. 2 years after his death, the policy moved in the opposite direction. The collectivization campaign that Stalin launched in 1928 and 1929 was, in its economic logic, the precise inversion of what Dzerzhinsky had argued for at the podium. The peasant was not to be protected from extraction. The peasant was to be extracted from. The result was the famine of 1932 and 1933. Between 5 million and 7 million people died. The majority were in Ukraine and Kazakhstan. They died of hunger in a country that was exporting grain. Dzerzhinsky had not predicted this specific catastrophe. He had not known in July of 1926 that things would go this far, this fast. But he had identified with precision the structural conditions that made it possible. The gap between what the state said it was doing for rural people and what it was actually doing, the pricing mechanisms that transferred wealth from the countryside to the industrial sector, the institutional dishonesty that prevented accurate accounting of what those mechanisms were producing. He had been right. He had said so loudly in the largest available forum to the people with the power to change it. Nobody helped. Sophia Dzerzhinsky outlived her husband by 42 years. She died in 1968 at 87 years old in Moscow. In interviews she gave in her later years, she returned repeatedly to the afternoon of July 20th, 1926. Not to the speech, not to the politics, to the hours after, to the decision she had made or failed to make when her husband came home from the Kremlin and lay down and she did not call the doctor quickly enough or called and waited or understood that something was wrong and could not make herself act on the understanding with the speed that the moment required. She remembered it for 42 years. Their son, Jan Dzerzhinsky, was 11 years old when his father died. He grew up in the shadow of a name that meant different things in different decades, heroic in some, sinister in others, complicated in the ones that tried to reckon with both. He became an engineer. He died in 1960 at 45 years old of heart failure, almost the same age as his father, the same organ. The same refusal, apparently, to stop working when the body required it. Some things are not metaphors. Some things are just genetics and the particular stubbornness that runs in certain families, like a current under still water, invisible until the moment it pulls you down. The book exists. You can find it online. It is called Three Last Speeches, printed in 1927, and it is not hidden behind any archive wall or classified designation. It sits in open access, readable by anyone with an internet connection and 30 minutes of patience. It has been there, in digital form, since the early 2000s. Before that, it sat in libraries, uncirculated, unread, gathering the particular dust of things that do not fit. It was never banned because nobody needed to ban it. The Soviet censorship apparatus, for all its thoroughness, understood something that is still true. The most effective way to make something disappear is not to destroy it, but to ensure that nobody thinks it is worth reading. A slim volume about overhead costs and procurement irregularities written by a man everyone already thinks they understand. And who's going to open that? Almost nobody did. For nearly a century, almost nobody did. There is a detail in the transcript that you only notice if you read the full document rather than the excerpts that appear in the occasional footnote. The sentences get shorter toward the end. In the first 30 minutes of the speech, Dzerzhinsky's sentences are long, structured, elaborately argued. The sentences of someone building a case brick by brick, making sure the foundation is solid before adding the next layer. By the final 30 minutes, they are clipped, direct, sometimes 3 or 4 words. The parenthetical notations thin out. The room has gone quiet in a different way than before. Not the quiet of attention, but the quiet of people watching something they cannot look away from and cannot name. The stenographer who recorded those pages did not know she was documenting the last 2 hours of a dying man's working life. She was doing her job, following the words, keeping pace, marking the interruptions and the silences in the standard notation. She had no way of knowing that the acceleration she was recording, the shortening sentences, the compressed pauses, the voice pushing faster against some internal pressure she could not see, that this was a body running out of time and refusing to stop. She recorded it anyway. That is what stenographers do. They record what is there, without interpretation, without selection. The document she produced is, among other things, an accidental medical record. The last 2 hours of a damaged heart working at full capacity, written down in shorthand by a woman whose name does not appear anywhere in the archive. The monument to Dzerzhinsky stood in Lubyanka Square in Moscow from 1958 to 1991. 33 years, it was removed on the night of August 22, 1991. By a crowd that had gathered in the hours after the failed coup against Gorbachev. They attached ropes to it and pulled. When the ropes were not enough, a crane was brought. The statue came down at approximately 11 o'clock at night to significant noise from the crowd. The people who pulled it down were not thinking about overhead costs. They were not thinking about the pricing of iron nails in rural markets or the gap between official production statistics and actual production conditions. They were thinking about the Lubyanka building behind the statue, about what that building had been used for, about the institution whose founder stood frozen in bronze in front of it. They were thinking about the single image they had of the man, the image that had been accurate enough to stand in for everything else. They were not wrong to think about that. The image they had was real. The institution he built did what they knew it had done. None of that is in dispute. But the 40 pages were also real. The 2 hours were also real. The hand pressed to the chest, the gray face, the sentence at the end, "Ask for your help." Those were also real, and the crowd in Lubyanka Square on the night of August 22nd did not know about them because almost nobody did. The statue now stands in Museon Park, in a sculpture garden along the Moscow River, where decommissioned Soviet monuments have been gathered like retired objects in a storage room. It stands among figures of Lenin and Stalin and various heroes of socialist labor. In summer, people walk past with ice cream. Children are photographed in front of it. Nobody reads the plaque very carefully. Problems Dzerzhinsky described in that speech: The bureaucratic misrepresentation, the gap between what institutions report and what they actually do, the political positioning substituted for engagement with real conditions, the extraction from the productive base to serve the administrative one. These problems did not die with him. They did not die with the Soviet Union. They did not die with the 20th century. They changed shape. They acquired new vocabularies, new technological frameworks, new institutional forms. The dishonest accounting moved into new systems. The gap between reported performance and actual performance found new ways to be maintained and new audiences to be maintained for. The substitution of the appearance of work for the work itself, what Dzerzhinsky called political maneuvering, what we might call other things now, became, if anything, more sophisticated. He was shouting about something permanent. He was shouting about it in a specific room on a specific afternoon. But the thing he was shouting about has no address and no date. It is not a Soviet problem. It is not a historical problem. It is a structural problem, which means it is a present problem, which means it is yours. Dzerzhinsky died for nails. Not literally, he died of heart failure in his apartment on a Tuesday afternoon in July. But the thing that killed him was not the cardiac damage alone, and anyone who has read the 40 pages knows it. What killed him was the specific combination of knowing something urgent and true, having shouted it into an institutional void for 4 years, and then standing at a podium in a closed hot room and shouting it one more time. Harder, faster, with shorter sentences and no water, and a hand pressed to his chest because the alternative was not shouting it. The man who signed detention orders and ran the Cheka, and whose name was used to frighten children into obedience, spent the last afternoon of his life arguing that a peasant should be able to afford basic hardware. This is not a redemption narrative. It is not an argument that the other things did not happen or did not matter. It is simply a fact recorded in shorthand by a woman whose name we do not know, preserved in a slim volume that nobody read, digitized and uploaded to the open internet, where it waited, quietly, for someone to find it. Here it is. You found it. The stenogram does not care what you do with it, but it has been waiting a long time for someone to read to the end,